जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम डॉक्टर साहब, डॉक्टर हसन and Rafi Alam, Ahmed Rafi Alam साहब.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम। आवाज आ रही है जी क्लियरली?
जी, I can hear you very well. I think Dr. Hassan is trying, is connecting. So, do you have a formal presentation, Rafi Alam?
Well,
Or
I
still do
am a lawyer and I believe in the dark arts of persuasion, and that power corrupts, and that PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. And so I'm just going to talk.
Oh, this will be great. Yeah, it would be really. I'm sure it's going to be very interesting discussion today that we're going to have. And
I might have a map or two to show. So if you can allow me to share a screen in case I want to show a map or an image, I can throw it up.
yeah, sure, certainly. I will do that. I'll do that. Yeah, yeah. So, Dr. Hassan, can you hear me? Dr. Hassan, I do not know whether I'm audible or not. Great, great. I can see you, Dr. Hassan, but am I audible?
You are audible. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes, I can hear you now. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you very much. I must say, thank you very much, Dr. Hassan, and thank you very much, Ahmed Rafi Alef Saab. You are really great for just listening to me and my request and making yourself available for this wonderful topic, which is water development and water laws in South Asia. And I hope I had given some invitation to people outside Pakistan. I do not know because of the time zone problem, they would be able to join us or not. Um, but if they join a little later, um, doesn't matter. I think they can join us. So should we begin by just giving me, there is something in the chat, no sound. Somebody is saying there is no sound. Does it mean that I am not audible? Then the problem would be, I think, on your side. Okay, let me just start this. And as I said, that let's have it both formal and informal kind of a presentation come discussion. And while we take questions from the audience as well, um, our topic is water development and water laws in South Asia. And we have with us a very, must say, experts in their respective field. We have got Dr. Hassan Abbas, who has a doctorate in water resources from USA and has a vast experience of water integrated water resource management. And he has worked, I would say, uh, all over the globe. I would say if you have been to the, I think you had mentioned it somewhere in Svalbard near the North Pole. So you have touched the North Pole as well. So that sounds so great to me. And that would be very interesting if you bring in some of your experience from there as well. So his, as I said, his prime focus is on integrated management of water resources. And he, of course, is going to have, he has a perspective, and I'm sure we would love to hear his perspective. We have Ahmed Rafi Alam Saab. He is an environmental lawyer. I think there are lawyers, very few people I think would be there who would say they are environmental lawyers. So he is one of them, and he is a partner at Seemi Waheed, which is a law firm which specializes in energy, water, and natural resources and urban infrastructures. So I think he has got, again, experience in environment, law, regulation, and regulatory advices to international organization, to federal government, and to the provincial governments as well. And he has been the chairman of the LESCO, the Lahore Electric Supply Company, and Lahore Waste Management Company. So without much ado, I would just request to please start the conversation or discussion. And I think Dr. Hassan Abbas will start the discussion. And then, of course, Ahmed Rafi Alam can join. I mean, I leave it to you. I said it's not very structured, but I think it should be like kind of a discussion. So, Dr. Saab.
Ji, thank you very much. I am really honored to be invited on this very important Zoom session of University of Management Sciences, Lahore, and on a very important topic, which is basically the development of water resources in Indus Basin in particular, and in South Asia in general. Now, the development of water resources in the Indus Basin in relatively modern times began somewhere in the 1850s, when British started creating canal colonies on various tributaries of the Indus River system. The first ones were built from Madhupur headworks on Ravi River, followed by Sirhind Canal system on Satluj River, and then Ravi, Satluj, Chenab, Beas, all those rivers started getting turned into canal colonies until 1947, when the two countries became separated and independent, separated from each other and independent from the British Crown, and started their journey as independent countries on the world map. Okay, now the development of so-called water resources of the Indus Basin, especially after 1947, they started as water problem between water sharing between Pakistan and India, because in 1948, it was 1st of April 1948, when India shut down the canals leading into the irrigated area of Pakistan and asserted that this water belongs to India and Pakistan has to pay for it, and India has all the right to stop all the water flowing into Pakistan from their boundary. Now, that act of aggression, that water aggression by India back in 1948, from all the intellectual angles, from all the norms and customs, from all the laws and regulations, treaties, was an act of very violent aggression. And it had no international standing, no backing by any means, legal or moral, that a country could do that. But nevertheless, India did that, and it started a dispute between India and Pakistan. And since these two newly independent countries were quite visible on the map, and all the countries around the world, especially the bigger powers, they were very much interested in how the future of these two countries would emerge, and how this part of South Asia, which was the subcontinent, how it would fare in the international relations. So there was a big global interest in the dispute, which started as a water dispute between the two countries. And then this was also the time when World War had recently finished and new global order was emerging, new economic order of the world was emerging. And at the same time, this Cold War was heating up. That communist bloc and capitalist bloc, the NATO allies and the Warsaw Pact, those things were, they were all very hot on the political stage. And unfortunately, this water dispute between India and Pakistan was caught up in the flames of Cold War. And the interest groups, both political and financial, moved in, and they started dictating the two countries how to go about solving their water dispute in a way that the two countries, they become the instruments of the Cold War. And it was David E. Lilienthal, who is considered the chief architect of the Indus Water Treaty and all the works which took place as a consequence of Indus Water Treaty. Now, this guy, he was, by profession, he was a lawyer. And whatever he advised, it was followed by the two governments. It was pushed by the then Bank of Development and Reconstruction, which was later known as World Bank. There were quite a few conflict of interests in the way this whole thing was moved forward. Now, Mr. Lilienthal wrote about Kashmiri dispute and water dispute in two very famous articles. One of the articles was titled, Are We Losing India? In which he argued that since China has moved into communist bloc after her independence, let India not do the same, because if India also drifts into communist bloc, America would be left alone without any major partners, significant partners in Asia. And America should not let it happen. And he argued that as long as Nehru is in power, he is a favorable guy, and America should establish their relations with India in the next 10 years or so. And those relationships will go for a very long time. And of course, there were quite a few things which were serving Cold War agenda by establishing good relationship with India. Then he wrote another article which was titled Another Korea, in which he argued that Pakistan should not get indulged in a war with India, because that would create a situation like Korea, in which America might get involved. And in order to avoid that situation, India and Pakistan should solve their water dispute, ignoring any political, religious, or for that matter, cultural, or anything which are related to that water dispute. And he advised that Pakistan and India should only solve this water dispute with the help of engineers and financiers. And he argued that this is a financial problem and an engineering problem, and all the other stakeholders should not even bother what the engineers and financiers are doing. Now, there were quite a few conflict of interests which have been identified in the British memoirs, which Lilienthal had, and some of those conflict of interests were like Lilienthal had his own construction company working on the projects in India which were diverting waters of Pakistan even prior to the treaty. Now, we must not forget that the Devian formula, on which the treaty was based, was ultimately signed in 1960, in which India was allowed to divert the waters of the three eastern rivers away from Pakistan and 100% away from Pakistan. Uh, Although the treaty was signed in 1960, all the structures to divert waters were already built between 1948 and 1960, except two major structures, which were Pong Dam and Theen Dam. All the other structures were already in place. These structures included Bhakra Dam, Nangal Dam, Firozpur Feeder, Rupar Headworks. Then feasibility studies on Theen Dam and Pong Dam had already taken place. Then Hussaini Wala Headwork was replaced by Harike Headwork. Madhupur Byas Link Canal was already made. Rajasthan Canal was already made. So all those structures, they were already made prior to signing of the treaty. And all these structures were in violation of any international standards or any international laws which prevailed at that time. And it was Lilienthal, who himself was a lawyer, he said this thing in his articles, that Pakistan has a very strong case against India. And if Pakistan goes to international court, Pakistan will win the case. But he at the same time argued that Pakistan should be prevented from going into the international court and pursue her case, which was a very strong case, and just submit to the suggestions by the financial managers and the engineers of how to actually divide the rivers and how to just create structures. Now, this is where the international laws were ignored, because international laws had the provisions where this division of water or the water sharing formula could have been much different and much peaceful than it turned out to be. Not just in international laws on water were ignored, also the science was ignored. The science of water management that starts with the very basic thing, which is called the equation of continuity, which states that whatever water is coming into a system and whatever water is leaving a system, a natural system, the difference between the two is the change in storage of the system. And for long-term sustainability of any system, the net change in storage should be zero. Now, Mr. Lilienthal, he advised that all the water coming into the rivers should not stay in the rivers. He said that if the water is taken out of the rivers, it is used. But if it is staying in the river, it is not used. And if the water is flowing out into the sea, it is being wasted. So he advised both countries that both countries should build infrastructure that should take the water out of the rivers and do not let it go to the sea. Now, if the water is coming into the rivers and it's not going out, over a long period of time, that water will start accumulating in the landscape because it has to go somewhere. And if it's not going anywhere, part of it could be evaporated, but then part of it would stay in the landscape. And we ended up with major problems of waterlogging and salinity, both in Indian Punjab, Pakistani Punjab, and especially in the province of Pakistan's province of Sindh. Now today, the whole province of Pakistan, which is Sindh, is about 90% suffering from waterlogging issues. Why? Because the water that was prevented from flowing back to the sea, that was in violation of the basic principles of hydrology and science, is now accumulating in the landscape, causing all the problems of waterlogging and salinity and pollution. The projects like the unsustainable projects like LBOD and RBOD were undertaken. The unsustainable projects like scarp tube wells were undertaken. but to no avail. Everything is still creating problems, and we are in a very bad state as far as the violation of the equation of continuity is concerned. Because this was the advice which came from a person who was not even an engineer, who was not even a hydrologist. And we, the both countries, India and Pakistan, in the development of Indus Basin, had been following that unscientific principle of not letting the water flow back to the sea, not letting the water keep flowing into the river courses, but just keep on building structures to keep to let the rivers run dry. And that's what the two countries are still doing. The boondoggles of projects, which are also a consequence of Indus Water Treaty, are like the Kishan Ganga project of India, which was kind of a compulsion for Pakistan to create Neelam Jhelum project of the same kind, and thereby they have destroyed Neelam Valley, one of the most beautiful valleys on the planet. That has been destroyed again as a consequence of Indus Water Treaty, which forced the two countries to build as much hydropower and as much storage facilities and as much dams and as much diversions as possible. And consequently, the third thing which completely got ignored in the development, post 1947 development, was the environment. There was no provision for environmental flow left in the rivers. There was no provision for environment of any kind left in the treaty. And it is again very strange that since 1947, it had been written in many texts, it had been argued by many scientists that the groundwater resource of the Indus Basin is about 10 times bigger than the annual flow of the river, about 10 times bigger. Like if the annual flow is 200 MAF, the groundwater storage within the basin was in the tune of 2000 MAF. Knowing this thing, documented the fact, despite this thing, no project of any significance was ever advised in managing and taking advantage of the huge groundwater reserves, and everything was focused on surface water. Environment was ignored, laws were ignored, science was ignored, and consequently, today what we have, Indus Basin has the most polluted rivers anywhere on the planet. Indus River's irrigation system, both India and Pakistan, is one of the most inefficient in terms of water use in the world. And then the treaty, which was supposed to solve disputes, this region has the most disputed waters in any river systems anywhere in the world. The farmer is fighting with the farmer, the provinces are fighting with the provinces, the countries are fighting with the countries, and the dispute of water is yet to be solved. That dispute, that mistrust, and that societal discord is increasing with every passing day. And last but not the least, we have the most degraded ecosystems anywhere anywhere in the world. We have destroyed the world's sixth largest delta, which was a lifeblood, not just for the delta itself, for the ecology of the delta itself, but also for the entire Indian Ocean. Deep sea fish of the Indian Ocean had depended on Indus Delta for breeding and spawning. Just to mention one of the very small things here. And then the migratory birds from Siberia to South Africa had depended on the wetlands of the Indus system. They are not existent anymore. We have destroyed Ramsar sites. We have destroyed our rivers. We have destroyed our culture. And this is what had been the development of Indus Basin, especially since after 1947. So I leave it here, and let's see how the discussion goes from this point onwards.
Ji Ahmed Rafi sir.
Gee, thank you, Dr. Waheed, and thank you, UMT, for organizing this wonderful conversation and for inviting myself. I've, of course, benefited from hearing Dr. Abbas, and I always benefit from listening to him. You know, there is a dominant discourse on water in Pakistan. We did a study about 6 years ago, surveying perceptions on water for the Chatham Institute in London. And we surveyed hundreds of people in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh on their various opinions on water. I was part of the team in Pakistan. We must have interviewed about 300 people. If you ask 300 people a bunch of questions on water, I assure you, and it's, you know, you can understand, you'll get 1,000 different answers. But there were two things that everybody were unanimously agreed on, which was rare. And the first is that Pakistan is not about to reach a water crisis. Pakistan is in a water crisis. And those are 14 ki baat kar raha hu. And the second is that there were absolutely no women in decision making, either at the institutional level or the policy level, in water in Pakistan at all. And I want to use that point, this sort of finding from that survey, to highlight how the discourse on water in Pakistan has been dominated essentially by retiring or retired male bureaucrats, hydrologists from the irrigation department, or frankly, generals chipping in on national security and Indian aggression. But I tell you, if you get a bunch of retiring or retired old men, generals and bureaucrats, and put them in a room and ask them to solve Pakistan's water problems, they're going to talk about dams and millions of acres of feet and hydrological infrastructure. And while their solutions aren't invalid, the point I'm trying to make is that water is something that operates on many scales. You know, like the substance itself, if you put it into a different vessel, it adopts a different shape. And we can't confine our thinking on water purely in terms of what we can pipe or what we can dam. And I often retort back to people that, you know, I wish I had the ability of getting some of the best poets and writers in Pakistan and putting them in a room and asking them, why don't you solve the problems of water in Pakistan? Because they would, not being invalid, their contributions would be on a different scale. And we must not forget that these scales are equally valid and should all be listened to without preference of one over the other. What we have in Pakistan is a very dominant discourse that bases itself on these hydrological interventions. Dr. Saab has given a fantastic overview of some of the forces affecting the development of water or water development in Pakistan, especially after the partition. And I agree. I would tend to say that in my mind, there are three major forces that have shaped the water infrastructure and our understanding of water in South Asia. And those would be the monsoon, colonialism, and the World Bank. And I want to spend a bit of time right now talking about the history of water law in South Asia and really focus a little bit on the colonial powers that shaped our modern understanding of water law and what Dr. Saab was saying, our inability to adjudicate water disputes. Now, the history of water law, modern water law in South Asia can be linked back to the, you could say, assumption of Sindh and Punjab by the British in 1842 and 1849. Because it was from then, and Punjab at that point included parts of what are now KPK and Kashmir. And so really at that point, we had in modern history a single political entity that controlled the entire basin politically. And so we see from that point onwards, in response, incidentally, to repeated famines, and we understand famines to be failures of governance. There were repeated famines in Bengal, and there were repeated famines in Punjab, embarrassing the British administration as far as in Europe, where even Karl Marx was extremely critical of the millions of people who were losing their lives purely because the British were using the lands of Punjab for resource extraction rather than for the benefit of the people who lived there. And so in response, the canal colonies start. as a means of not just securing food and adequate food for people and making sure there weren't any famines, but also for, as Dr. Imran Ali has written in his book, for many reasons. There were land grants given to people in canal colonies who had supported the British during 1857. And I think it is in Crossed Swords, Shuja Nawaz links the history of landed aristocracy in Punjab with military control to the grant of land in canal colonies as favors from the British Empire. But along with these canal colonies, in Punjab especially, the British then rolled out a series of legislation. Because ab aap logon ko zameen de rahe hain. Much like modern housing schemes, jab sadak ban jati hai to phir plot biकते हैं. In a canal colony, जब canal लग जाता है तो फिर मरब्बे जो हैं वो allot किए जाते हैं. And so we needed to have a Transfer of Property Act. We needed to have a Tenancy Act that regulated how people would possess and succeed their properties. We needed to have, one of the associated property legislations was called the Easements Act. I'll mention that later. And we had canal and drainage legislation as well, all starting from about the 1860s to about the late 1880s, early 1890s. And it's this legal framework that gives you property laws and water laws in its origins in South Asia. In Sindh, there was also infrastructure, but different from the Punjab. In Sindh, the inundation canals were repaired and made perennial canals. And some of them were so successful that the town of Khanga in what's now Balochistan was renamed Jacobabad after John Jacobs, the engineer who built the canal there, the desert canal. But the irrigation law, the Canal and Drainage Acts are fairly straightforward. They empower the government, the provincial government, because Canal and Drainage Acts are provincial laws. So they empower the provincial government to take natural water or water from natural resources, be that in a river, be that in a stream, and later on underwater as well, and to divert this water for a public purpose. And also then for that public purpose allows the government to construct canals for these diversions as well. The Easements Act, which I had mentioned earlier, is one of the many laws on property that the British introduced. Section 7E has a very, very peculiar, you could say, and very important point on water law, because it says that anyone who owns land which is connected to underground water, which then owns that underground water. So anybody who finds water on their property, under their property, can claim ownership of it, provided, of course, that that water is not in a defined channel. It's a very interesting phraseology, that anything above and below your property is yours if it's connected to the property, including water resources, provided that water is not in a defined channel. And that's very interesting because Dr. Philip Culey of SOAS University talks about the Easement Act, because you see, you are introducing a concept of law ascribing the ownership, individual ownership of water based on the ownership of property. The Easements Act is not indigenous to India. It was imported from England, where it was part of the common law discourse. So the Easements Act of 1882, as it was introduced in India, is actually a reflection of what the British law on water, individual water rights was and had been developed through the 17th and 18th century. उस प्रिंसिपल को उठाकर आप हिंदुस्तानी जमीन के अंदर आप या हिंदुस्तानी कौम पे आप आकर लगा देते हैं. And Culey says, look, the thing is that in England, if you don't like the weather, it rains after 10 minutes. वहाँ groundwater का मसला नहीं है, but that in India, there are actually deserts that are larger than the entire footprint of the United Kingdom. How can you have, in a country like Pakistan, where people are poor, the right of ownership of water restricted only to people who are propertied? And so the Easements Act sets up what we know as riparian law, the ownership of water that's connected to the ownership of your land. And this riparian law actually goes much, much further back from the British colonial laws or the British laws, common laws. It goes back to Roman law, because it was the Romans who said that flowing water is a public good. So anything in a defined channel cannot be owned by an individual because it's a public good. And the fact that defined channel finds its way in a Pakistani legislation that we observe today, connect in many ways very illustrative of how backdated and outdated the legislations that control water around us are today. That said, the state's right with respect to the diversion of water for public use is stronger than the individual's right to have water, because the state can take that water, it can acquire it for the public purpose. What's left now is an understanding then of the relative position of states or provinces within India when it comes to provincial water disputes. हमने irrigation law तो कर लिया है for within the province, हमने individuals के rights riparian law के तहत set कर लिए हैं, but there wasn't anything in the Government of India Act of the 1800s or even Government of India Act 1919 that allowed any of the provinces or states of pre-partition India to resolve their water disputes. Which is why in 1919, 1920, the state of Bahawalpur objected to Punjab's plans to divert the water of the river Satluj, essentially to the state of Bikaner, because they had supported the British in 1857. Though the state of Bahawalpur said that the water from the Satluj would be diverted to their detriment. And because there wasn't a legal framework or a platform or an adjudicatory forum for the states to adjudicate their rights, resort at that time was to a treaty known as the Tripartite Treaty of 1921. It's the first water accord, you could say, of South Asia, and sets out how the development of water resources would be done and how benefits would be shared between the three provinces or the three entities involved in the agreement. This lack of adjudicatory forum issue was resolved in 1935 with the passing of the Government of India Act, 1935. And the Government of India Act essentially allowed states who had a dispute with another state to refer that dispute to the Governor General for adjudication. And this is now very, very important from a conceptual point of view, because the second you allow for adjudication, interstate adjudication, you also concede that no state within India has total and absolute control over their water resources. You see, once you have a dispute resolution forum, you understand it's implied that states have shared rights that can be adjudicated amongst themselves. So a very important platform was introduced by the Government of India Act 1935, and it was activated almost immediately by the province of Sindh, that was very concerned that the planned development of the Bhakra Dam, when superimposed with the Thal and Haveli projects in Punjab, would cause detriment to water resource availability in Sindh. This matter was then referred to the Governor General, who formed a commission and appointed Justice B.N. Rao, a Bengali jurist of international fame, I should also say, who retired eventually as a judge of the International Court of Justice. But Justice Rao then formed the what's now known as the Rao Commission, that published its report in 1942. And this report sets out the principles upon which states in India will adjudicate their disputes. Justice Rao looks at various, you could say, transboundary dispute resolution mechanisms and formulas. For example, the Harman Doctrine, which is an absolute doctrine of sovereignty of water resources. Justice Rao rejected it as alien to India and its laws. And similarly, the American principle of first utilizer of water, a principle that grew from the oil fields of Texas and California, not really suited to water law, was also rejected. And Justice Rao therefore asserted that the means by which states in India should resolve their disputes would be on the basis of, let me see here. Equitable apportionment are the words used. And you'll find, incidentally, that equitable apportionment was also the principle of water dispute resolution in vogue internationally at that time as well. So Justice Rao is not taking an abstract concept. He's introducing this concept and saying this is the concept that states will use to adjudicate their disputes. Unfortunately for Justice Rao, the recommendations of his report could not be implemented in time, as partition took place in 1947. Now, partition, you have to understand, is a fundamental reordering of the provincial water infrastructure in Punjab. It sliced the water infrastructure in half. And what that did, leaving, for example, the construction of Bhakra Dam now solely in Indian responsibility, this fundamentally reorders the dispute that Sindh had with Punjab at a legal level. So while the principle of equitable apportionment still remains, it was impossible for Sindh to resolve its dispute because the physical infrastructure that it was concerned about had been split apart by the partition itself. Now, if partition is a fundamental reordering of the infrastructure of water in Pakistan and in India, let me say that the imposition of one unit in Pakistan in 1954, in my opinion, is the second fundamental reordering, as it were, or it sets about the second fundamental reordering of water in Pakistan. Because with one unit, the 4 provinces are dissolved, the 4 provinces of West Pakistan are dissolved, the 4 irrigation departments are wound up and replaced with 1 secretary, 1 chief engineer, and 4 additional engineers. Now, what happens is a provincial subject, water is a provincial subject, the water infrastructure has always been owned by the provinces. Now we have a West Pakistan province that spatially covers the entirety of Pakistan. So even though it is a provincial subject, the control is over the entirety of Pakistan because there weren't any provinces at that point. And it's really during this one unit period that we see the centralization of water control rather than the disparate provincial controls over water that really the law envisages. We see this centralization through, for example, the West Pakistan Water and Power Development Authority Act of 1948, mirrored incidentally by the East Pakistan Water and Power Development Authority Act of 1958 for what is now Bangladesh, because water was a provincial subject. This entity, WAPDA, which is now a federal entity, was given control over the water resources of the entire country, what's now the entire country of Pakistan. And when you coincide this with the Indus Treaty and the fact that it was WAPDA that undertook the Indus Basin development reconstruction works, we now see how a centralized agency is now controlling water, even though water is a provincial subject. This is a fundamental reordering, the lessons of which we are still learning today. Then we have the Indus Water Treaty, which I also mentioned is a fundamental reordering, because the Indus Water Treaty changes the allocation of water from the Indus to the Punjab through the means of these connection canals or diversion canals, as they were called. And that changes the nature or the infrastructure and the relationship between Sindh and Punjab, and it reorders the dispute between Sindh and Punjab as well. And let's not forget that the Indus Water Treaty was negotiated during one unit when there was no province of Sindh even envisaged. And I think it's Danish Mustafa who, in his article on contested waters, says that one unit actually sets up an internal tension in Pakistan, sets it up against the Indus Water Treaty because the voices of the provinces weren't properly appreciated during the negotiation period. Something that Dr. Saab highlighted when he talks about the weaknesses of the Indus Treaty. And yet, you know, the Indus Treaty is touted as a successful treaty. इनके बहुत vociferous proponents हैं. एक दो मेरे दोस्त आज attendance में भी हैं. Assalamu alaikum. बैंक के लोग हैं, वो कहते हैं कि treaty is a very good thing. But as a lawyer, a treaty is meant to prevent wars between states. That is what a treaty does. But हमें कहा जाता है, look at this treaty, it has withstood wars. But ये किस तरह की treaty होती है, which allows countries to go to war? And as Dr. Saab has ably pointed out, this treaty was set out in ignorance of the ecology, in ignorance of international law. There's no other transboundary water sharing agreement that divides the resource of the river. All other transboundary arrangements in the world are sharing arrangements. हमने तो divide कर दिया है, 3 rivers इस तरफ, 3 rivers इस तरफ. And it has resulted in ecological devastation of the basins of the eastern rivers. You know, a large part of the drinking water problems of Lahore and the Bari Doab come from the fact that our aquifer can't be replenished by supplies from the Ravi anymore. because Ravi हमने हिंदुस्तान को दे दिया, and as Dr. Saab said, वो Pheem Dam उन्होंने वहां बना दिया. Achha, 1970, I'm just going to wind up 2 minutes. One more point I wanted to end on this disputes. One unit comes to an end after 71, 72, and in 73 we get our present constitution. The present constitution contains the same dispute resolution mechanism that was envisaged in the Government of India Act through the means of the Council of Common Interests. The Council of Common Interests is a constitutional body that consists of the Prime Minister, the 4 chief ministers, and some federal ministers appointed by the President. And it has 2 jobs: to formulate certain policies called policies in Part 2 of the Federal Legislative List. Uspe policies Council of Common Interest banati hai. In policies में पानी का कोई जिक्र नहीं है, incidentally. However, WAPDA is one of the institutions that the Council of Common Interest can set policy for. But water as a subject is not a federal subject and not something the Council of Common Interest can set policies on. But its second responsibility, there are 2 responsibilities of the Council of Common Interest. The second responsibility is to resolve water disputes between the provinces. That's its second responsibility. And to date, we haven't seen this forum properly activated. 73 ke baad, it was in 1976 that the President of Pakistan set up what's known as the Chief Justice's Commission to look at the Sindh and Punjab water dispute. But before this it consisted of the Chief Justice of Pakistan and the 4 Chief Justices of the Provincial High Courts. Before this commission could finalize its report, 1977 mein Ziaul Haq abrogated the Constitution and the Council of Common Interest no longer stood. And then I found out that only in December 2018, for the second time in the history of this constitution, Sindh filed a formal complaint against Punjab to the Council of Common Interests. In December 2018, a matter that the council then referred to the Attorney General and for which so far no recommendation or adjudication has taken place. Water is fundamentally a provincial subject throughout the history of this land, even in India and in Pakistan. Yet we have not evolved any history of adjudication on water. जो हमारा forum था, B.N. Rao का, 1973 के constitution का, उसको हमने सही तरह इस्तेमाल नहीं किया. We don't have a tradition of arguing civilly over water. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why we get into these heated debates about water as well. I wanted to end my comments here, and maybe we can move into a more conversation mode after this.
Okay, if you have finished, then I can open it for discussion. Okay, let me see if there are any questions from the audience, from the participants.
Yes, ma'am.
I think there's somebody with their.
Yes, I think there is. I can see a hand raised. There is first. This is Muhammad. I can't see your name. The next name, and then Kambar, and then Shehzada. So we move in this sequence.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Rafi Saab. I have a question from you. पहले कॉन्टेक्स्ट अगर मैं अपने क्वेश्चन का बना दूं कि जो करंट गवर्नमेंट है उसका जो गवर्नमेंट फॉर्म हुई है, जो बलूचिस्तान की पार्टीज एग्री इस पॉइंट पे उन्होंने किया है कि वो अफगान सिटीजन्स को सिटीजनशिप नहीं देंगे. साउथ एशिया में बहुत ज़्यादा स्टेटलेस कम्युनिटीज़ हैं. हर बड़े तीनों बांग्लादेश, पाकिस्तान, इंडिया, इन सब में स्टेटलेस कम्युनिटीज़ हैं. तो हमें पता है आपने 24 बोल दिया कि पाकिस्तान 2014 में ही क्लाइमेट क्राइसिस के अंदर था. क्लाइमेट क्राइसिस की वजह से मैस डिस्प्लेसमेंट होगी, माइग्रेशन होगी, इंटरनल होगी और क्रॉस बॉर्डर माइग्रेशंस होंगी. तो अब पाकिस्तान और साउथ एशिया इस मसले को कैसे डील करेगा? मतलब ये पॉलिसी वाला फोरम है, तो मुझे लगता है कि अगर मैं क्वेश्चन पूछ लूँ कि इस मैस डिस्प्लेसमेंट को जो आने लगी है उससे उसको कैसे हम डील करेंगे और आगे की पॉलिटिकल सिनेरियो कैसे होगा, क्योंकि आज भी हम लोगों को एक्सेप्ट नहीं करते, तो कल जब हज़ारों मिलियंस सिंधी, मालदीवियंस, बंगाली जब उनको मूव करना पड़ेगा अपनी जगह से, शहरों का बर्डन बढ़ेगा, तो हम क्या करेंगे? अभी हम क्या करें और तब हम क्या करेंगे जब माइग्रेशन बहुत ज़्यादा बढ़ जाएगी अल्टीमेटली?
See, I don't think migrations तो होती रहती है. The problem is, और आपकी बात बिल्कुल ठीक है, climate crisis की वजह से migrations बढ़ेंगी. It's very difficult to pinpoint what a climate migration is. For example, in the last 15 years in the Sindh Delta, there's been seawater intrusion near just east of Karachi. It's displaced tens of thousands of people. But it's difficult to pinpoint their displacement and the increasing urbanization in Karachi as purely climate events, because people move for many reasons. It could be the fact that village economies aren't as vibrant as urban economies. It could be to search for other opportunities. And so it's very difficult to lay down and identify what a climate refugee is going to look like or a climate migrant is going to look like. That said, I mean, there are other countries that have serious problems. Bangladesh is going to suffer incredible seawater rise, and they predict that unless something is done internationally about the climate crisis, they could have as many as 25 million people displaced into India. And India doesn't have the resources to be able to withstand that influx. The problem right now, my friend, is not the fact that there will be refugees. Refugees to honge. The problem is that our international legal framework hasn't come up with a system to adopt them. You see, during the 20th century wars, there were people that were displaced as a result of warfare. And in consequence to that, there were humanitarian laws like the International Conventions on Political Refugees. There's no legal status presently for a climate refugee. And I think we need to work towards that, so that once we have and I can identify climate refugees, states and individuals have obligations towards them. And that is well laid out. You have obligations to refugees on humanitarian grounds. So when you ask, हम क्या करेंगे? हम अपना घर खोलेंगे. हम अपना दिल खोलेंगे. That's what you do with refugees.
जी, कंबर.
सर, मेरा आपसे एक क्वेश्चन था. आपने ब्रिटिश राज का कहा कि हमारी वाटर पॉलिसीज पे कितना ज़्यादा इफेक्ट्स रहा है, तो मैं पूछना चाह रहा था जो मुग़ल, उससे पहले मुग़ल राज था, उनकी भी कोई वाटर पॉलिसीज थी या उन्होंने कुछ ऐसा बनाया था, या हम टोटली जो है ये सब कुछ आगे ब्रिटिश ने ही इसे मसलन के हमारी जो वाटर पॉलिसी थी उनसे रिसेंबल किया था और बनाया था?
That is a fantastic question, and I hope Dr. साहब इस पे आप भी थोड़ा सा तबसरा दें, because मैं चूंकि वकील हूं, हम कानून पढ़ते हैं और कानून अंग्रेजों ने हमारे लिए बनाए हैं, हम उससे पहले देखते नहीं हैं. This is unfortunately this the way we've been programmed to think, but not for a second should you assume that there was not canal or there was not water infrastructure in India. They were both. I mean, consider कि लाहौर के अंदर जो शालीमार बाग है, उसके लिए 270 किलोमीटर का कनाल जो है खोदा गया था रावी से, from a point higher than Lahore, that could be provided water, that could provide water for the benefit and the pleasure of the king. But what I understand is that a lot of water infrastructure was not the surface diversions that we recognize through the colonial interventions, but a lot of water infrastructure were these water wells and baulis that people had in communities. You see water wells in many cities. Lahore में इधर Queens Road पे क्या कहते हैं गंगाराम की बाउली होती थी, अंदरून शहर के अंदर होते थे. So there was different types of water control, except it's not formally documented in the legal tradition. But there are fantastic researchers who are doing work on this right now. Fazilda Nabil is one of them. She's done a PhD from UK on the subject as well. So there's lots of work and very, very interesting. Dr. Saab, इस पे आपका कोई है क्या कहते हैं knowledge?
जी, एक्चुअली जो कैनाल्स पाकिस्तान ये इंडो सब कॉन्टिनेंट पे जो बनी है, इसमें जो सबसे पहली कैनाल थी वो फिरोज शाह तुगलक ने मेरे ख्याल में 1358, इफ आई एम correctly remembering the date, but that was around the time फिरोज शाह तुगलक ने पहली कैनाल बनाई थी, जो कि यमुना कैनाल के नाम से बनाई गई थी. इट वाज मोर देन 100 किलोमीटर्स लॉन्ग कैनाल, اور یہ وہ پہلی کینال تھی جو کہ دریائے یمنا سے نکال کے تو اس کو یمنا اور ستلج کے جو واٹر شیڈ ہوتا ہے, یہ ہائیڈرولوجیکل ٹرم میں استعمال کر رہا ہوں, یہ آلموسٹ اس کے واٹر شیڈ کے اوپر اس کو چلایا گیا تھا. اور اس کینال کا جو مین مقصد تھا وہ یہ تھا کہ جس وقت مونسون میں زیادہ پانی آتا تھا دریا میں, تو اس کینال کے بیچ میں پانی آ جاتا تھا اور پھر یہ واٹر شیڈ کے اوپر چلتی ہوئی بہت دور تک پانی لے جاتی تھی. اور مین مقصد اس کینال کا اریگیشن نہیں تھا, بلکہ اس کا مقصد تھا شکار گاہوں کی مینٹیننس, کیونکہ یہ لوگ شکار کے کافی شوقین تھے. تو یہ شکار گاہوں میں پانی لے جاتے تھے, اور نارملی ان کینالز میں سے لوگوں کو پانی نکال کے اریگیشن کی اجازت نہیں ہوتی تھی. اسی قسم کی کینال جو ہیں وہ سندھ میں بھی بہت زیادہ بنی تھیں. کینال یہ تالپور اور کلہوڑاز وغیرہ کی جو حکومتیں رہیں سندھ میں, اس میں یہ کینالز بناتے ہوتے تھے. اور جو اس وقت سندھ کی میجر کینالز ہیں ان میں سے بہت سوں کی الائنمنٹ جو ہے یہ اسی دور کی بنائی ہوئی جو کینالز ہیں ان کے اوپر کی گئی تھی, جس میں مثلا بگاری کینال ایک آپ نے سنی ہوگی, سندھ میں کافی بڑی کینال ہے. اور اس کا نام بگاری کینال اس لیے ہے کیونکہ جب فلڈ کا سیزن آنا ہوتا تھا تو اس سے پہلے بگار کے طور پہ لوگوں کو اکٹھا کر کے لایا جاتا تھا اور اس کی صفائی کرائی جاتی تھی تاکہ اس کے بیچ میں پانی چلے اور پھر اگین شکار گاہوں پہ جو ہے اس سے مینٹین کی جائیں. اور یہ جو سندھ کا کوریڈور ہے دریائے سندھ کا, اس میں مطلب ہے کہ بہت گھنے جنگلات اور بڑی بڑی قسموں کے جو جانور تھے, مطلب ریچھ, شیر, چیتے, ہاتھی وغیرہ, یہ سب یہاں پہ پائے جاتے تھے نیچرل. اور جس وقت یہ انگریزوں نے سندھ کے اوپر قبضہ کرنے کا اور حملہ کرنے کا پروگرام بنایا تو اس میں انہوں نے ایک چارج شیٹ تیار کی تھی سندھ کے حکمرانوں کے خلاف, جس میں ایک انہوں نے چارج شیٹ میں یہ چیز بھی رکھی تھی کہ سندھ کے جو حکمران ہیں وہ لوگوں کو کینال کا پانی پوری طرح سے نہیں دیتے اور ان کو دریا کے قریب اس کینال کے پانی سے اریگیشن نہیں کرنے دیتے. اور انہوں نے یہ وعدہ کیا تھا کہ جب ہم سندھ پہ قبضہ کریں گے اور حکومت بنائیں گے تو ہم پھر لوگوں کو یہ کینال صاف کر کے پانی مہیا کیا کریں گے تاکہ لوگ اریگیشن کر سکیں. اسی طرح سے رافع نے آلریڈی ذکر کیا ہے اس کا جو کینال تھی آپ کی جو مادھوپور ہیڈ ورک سے شروع ہوتی تھی, مادھوپور سے شروع ہوتی تھی, ہیڈ ورک بعد اس پہ برٹش نے بنایا تھا, وہ 1638 میں میرے خیال میں شاہ جہاں نے بنوائی تھی, جو کہ اس کو شالیمار گارڈن کو اور لاہور کے شہر کو پانی دینے کے لیے بنائی گئی تھی. تو یہ جو کینالز ہیں اس ایریا میں دس از نتھنگ انوینٹیڈ بائی دا برٹش, یہ پہلے سے تھیں, لیکن برٹش کی اور جو کینالز بعد میں اس سے پہلے مغلیہ دور کی بنی ہوئی تھی اس میں فرق مین یہ تھا کہ ہم ہائیڈرولوجیکل ٹرمز میں کہتے ہیں اننڈیشن کینالز. اننڈیشن کینالز تھیں جو کہ پہلے بنی تھی مغلیہ دور میں, اور اس میں یہ کہ جب مونسون میں پانی چڑھتا تھا تو یہ دریا کے جو ہے وہ کینال کا راستہ کٹا ہوتا تھا دریا کے سائڈ پہ اور اس کے بیچ میں پانی آ جاتا تھا. لیکن جب مونسون کا پانی اترتا تھا تو پھر ان کینالز میں پانی جو ہے وہ ختم ہو جاتا تھا. برٹش نے جو ماڈیفیکیشن کی تھی وہ یہ تھی کہ اس نے دریا کے اوپر ہیڈ ورک بنا دیا تھا اکراس دا ریور, جس پہ جب دریا میں پانی کم بھی ہوتا تھا تو وہ ہیڈ ورک کی وجہ سے پانی کا لیول اتنا اونچا ہوتا تھا کہ کینال میں پانی جاتا رہتا تھا, اور اس میں یہ پیرینیل کینالز بن گئی تھی. تو بیسیکلی یہ جو کینالز بنانے کا سسٹم ہے اننڈیشن کینالز کا, یہ 10,000 سال پرانا سسٹم ہے, میسوپوٹیمیا میں شروع ہوا تھا. اس کے بعد میں فرعون نے 6,000 سال پہلے اس کو اڈاپٹ کیا تھا اور یہ مصر میں دریائے نیل کے اوپر بنا تھا. جہاں پہ مغلیہ دور میں انڈس سیولائزیشن بہت پرانی ہے, اس میں مغلیوں سے پہلے بھی یہ کینالز اس طرح سے چل رہی تھی, اور جو میجر اس کی ماڈیفیکیشن ہے وہ پھر آج سے 200 سال پہلے انگریز نے ہیڈ ورک بنا کے کی تھی. اس کے بعد جو 200 سال کے بعد کی ٹیکنالوجی ہے وہ ہم نے کوئی نئی چیز نہیں اڈاپٹ کی اور ہم وہی 200 سال پرانے سسٹم پہ چل رہے ہیں. جی
جی شہزادہ.
Assalamu alaikum. So we have lots of structures and diversions on the rivers, and we also have the Indus Water Treaty now. It is present and being implemented, and both the countries, India and Pakistan, they are both now considered water scarce countries. And all of this in the context of the political dispute between both the countries, which makes effective collaboration difficult. So I would like to know about the way forward. Is it in reforming the Indus water mechanism to include more effective mechanisms, uh, and to activate, to give a larger role to CCI to reform, to solve disputes within the country, or it is still possible to have our rivers run on the basis of the principle of continuity which was mentioned by Dr. Hassan. So what is the way forward for us now? Thank you.
डॉक्टर साहब मैं जरा एक सेकंड में कोशिश करता हूं, मैंने छोटी सी एक बात करनी है,
Sure.
because I know you can take this away completely. But my response to this would be कि देखिए भाईजान, आपने पानी किस चीज के लिए इस्तेमाल करना है? पानी हमारे पास बहुत है, if you think about it. ये जो scarcity की आपने बात की है, ये बरसात तो नहीं रुकने वाले. Yes, climate change is an issue, but we've got lots of water. अब ये देखें कि पाकिस्तान में पानी कहाँ जाता है? We're told कि 90% जो इरिगेशन में जाता है, तो ठीक है. इरिगेशन में कहाँ जाता है? चीनी में जाता है, चावल में जाता है, गंदम में जाता है, कपास में जाता है. चीनी हम एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं, गंदम हम क्या कहते हैं, कपास हम एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं, चावल हम एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं. There are 92 sugar mills in Pakistan. There are 21 ethanol plants in Pakistan that produce क्या कहते हैं, ethanol from the molasses of sugar mills. 2 साल पहले इन 21 कंपनीज ने $45 करोड़ का एथेनॉल पाकिस्तान से एक्सपोर्ट किया. उनसे कोई जाकर पूछें कि पाकिस्तान में पानी की कमी के है कि नहीं. टेक्सटाइल के जो सेठ हैं उनसे जाकर पूछें पाकिस्तान में पानी की कमी है कि नहीं. The question is, what do you want to use this water for? 150 साल पहले अंग्रेजों ने हमें खेतों पे काम लगा दिया because it was the easiest thing to do with a bunch of illiterate people. वही खेती बाड़ी, वही 600 साल पुराना सिस्टम अभी डॉक्टर साहब कह रहे हैं, वही टेक्नोलॉजी, इनंडेशन कैनाल्स, क्या कहते हैं, फ्लड इरिगेशन हम इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं. एंड वी आर टेकिंग 90% ऑफ द वाटर रिसोर्स. एंड nearly half of Pakistanis work in agriculture and most of them live by the poverty line. हम अपना सारा पानी एग्रीकल्चर में लगा रहे हैं और उसका नतीजा क्या है? Our people are just as poor and just as illiterate as they were 150 years ago. आपने इस पानी के साथ करना क्या है?
Gee, that was a very good point, Rafi. I can't agree more on this. जो आपने point of view दिया है, that is precisely a true point of view. राफे ने मेंशन किया है कि ये हमें उन्होंने खेती बाड़ी पे लगा दिया, और इसकी एक बड़ी मैं आपको इंटरेस्टिंग मिसाल देता हूँ हिस्ट्री से. जो अंग्रेज ने पहला कैनाल कमांड बनाया था ना, वो माधोपुर हेडवर्क पे बनाया था, और वो बड़ी अर्जेंसी में पूरा का पूरा कैनाल सिस्टम प्लान हुआ था. और इसकी थोड़े से आप टाइमिंग्स देखें. इट स्टार्टेड, द होल प्रोजेक्ट स्टार्टेड इन 1850. उससे एक साल पहले 1849 में पंजाब को अनेक्स किया गया था ब्रिटिश क्राउन के साथ, और राजा रंजीत सिंह था, उसकी अपनी डेथ तो 1839 में हो गई थी, लेकिन उसकी बनाई हुई फौज बहुत मजबूत थी, जिसको ब्रिटिश बड़े आराम से नहीं शिकस्त दे सके. उनको तकरीबन और 10 साल लगे उस फौज को शिकस्त देने में. और जब फाइनली इन्होंने 1849 में पंजाब को अनेक्स कर लिया, तो उनकी सबसे बड़ी वरी ये थी ब्रिटिश आर्मी की कि अगर डिसबैंडेड सिख आर्मी में कोई लीडरशिप आती है और ये लोग रीग्रुप हो जाते हैं, तो ये ट्रेंड सोल्जर्स हैं, ये हमारे लिए ट्रबल क्रिएट कर सकते हैं. तो उन्होंने क्या किया कि उन्होंने माधोपुर हेडवर्क के ऊपर कैनाल की स्कीम बनाई, और उस स्कीम पे उन्होंने दावत दी पुराने फौजियों को कि भाई आओ इधर आके कैनाल खोदो, और कैनाल खोदोगे तो तुम्हें जमीन मिल जाएगी. और ये प्रोजेक्ट 1878 तक चलता रहा. 28 साल तक वो फौजी जो बंदूक चलाता था वो कैनाल खोदता रहा और बूढ़ा हो गया, और उसके बच्चे को जमीन मिल गई. और इस तरह से उन्होंने ट्रेंड सिख आर्मी को फार्मर्स में कन्वर्ट कर दिया. तो ये एक बहुत बड़ा रीजन था पंजाब में कैनाल कॉलोनियां बनाने का. और क्योंकि ये सक्सेसफुल एक्सपेरिमेंट रहा, तो इन्होंने सरहिंद कैनाल में भी कैनाल कॉलोनी बना दी. और उस वजह से जो पाकिस्तान के बीच में, पाकिस्तानी पंजाब के बीच में जो कैनाल कॉलोनीज बनी हुई हैं, उसमें बहुत ज्यादा सिख लोग सेटल हुए थे. और अगर आप एलॉयस मिचेल की किताब पढ़ें द इंडस रिवर्स, तो उनमें उसने इस सोशल डेमोग्राफिक का जिक्र किया है, और इस सोशल डेमोग्राफिक की वजह से जो पोस्ट पार्टीशन कत्लो गारत हुआ, इसमें भी उसका एक बहुत बड़ा रोल है, क्योंकि बहुत सारे सिख जो हैं वो लुधियाना और दिल्ली और इन साइडों से माइग्रेट करके पाकिस्तान वाली जगह पे आगे हुए थे, जिनको अराजियां अलॉट हुई थी, और मुसलमानों को बहुत कम अराजियां अलॉट हुई थी, ज्यादा सिखों को अलॉट हुई थी। तो ये एक डेमोग्राफिक चेंज था। इसी तरह से एक सैयद अली नकवी की किताब है इंडस वाटर्स एंड सोशल चेंज, उसमें भी उन्होंने ये चीज जो बड़ी क्लियरली लिखी है कि कैनाल कॉलोनियां बनाने का मकसद कोई सोशल रिफॉर्म्स या इकोनॉमिक रिफॉर्म्स नहीं था, बल्कि लोगों को कंट्रोल करना था। और ये कंट्रोल का मैकेनिज्म जो ब्रिटिश ने अडॉप्ट किया, इसके मतलब है कि आप एक गेट कैनाल का बनाते हैं जिसके ऊपर हमेशा अंग्रेज एक्सियन बैठता है, जो कैनाल का गेट कंट्रोल करने का मजाज है, और उसके आगे कम से कम 200-250 गांव हैं जो उस कैनाल के थ्रू कंट्रोल हो रहे हैं। यानी अगर आपने लोगों को कंट्रोल करना है तो आपने सिर्फ कैनाल का गेट बंद कर देना है और लोग अंडर कंट्रोल आ जाएंगे। तो ये एक कॉलोनियल डिजाइन था, ये लोगों को कंट्रोल करने का तरीका था। और अनफॉर्चुनेटली आजादी के बाद हमारे जो हुक्मरान आए, उनको ये कंट्रोल बड़ा अच्छा लगा, और आज भी उसी कंट्रोल के ऊपर आपका पूरा वडेरा सिस्टम चल रहा है, आपके पूरे इलेक्शंस चल रहे हैं, आपके पूरी कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंसीज चल रही हैं। और यही पानी के कंट्रोल की वजह से, पानी की चुदराहट की वजह से आपका पूरा जो रूरल सेटअप है वो चल रहा है। और आपने तो अभी तक सोचा ही नहीं है कि आपने वाटर इकोनॉमी को लेके कैसे चलना है। आपको मैं एक चीज बड़ी क्लियर बताता चलूं कि पानी जो है ना, पानी ने हमेशा लोगों को यूनाइट किया है। अगर आप हिस्ट्री में देखें तो जितनी सिविलाइजेशंस बनी है दुनिया में बड़ी बड़ी, वो तमाम पानी के गिर्द बनी है। इसका मतलब है कि जब एक सिविलाइजेशन बनी है और वो पानी की वजह से बनी है, तो पानी तो कुदरत ने एक ऐसा एलिमेंट बनाया है जो लोगों को यूनाइट करता है। तो फिर पानी पे वॉर कैसी? वाई वाटर वॉर? पानी सिर्फ और सिर्फ लोगों को उस वक्त डिवाइड करता है जब लोग पानी को डिवाइड करते हैं। और ये काम अंग्रेज ने आपके खित्ते में आके किया। उसने लोगों को पानी पे डिवाइड किया, उसने पानी को डिवाइड किया और लोगों को डिवाइड किया, डिवाइड एंड रूल। और आज भी हिंदुस्तान पाकिस्तान क्यों लड़ रहे हैं? क्योंकि हमने अपने पानियों को डिवाइड कर दिया। जब तक हम पानियों को डिवाइड रखेंगे हम लड़ते रहेंगे। जिस दिन हमने पानियों की डिवीजन खत्म करके कॉमन रिवर्स और कॉमन इकोलॉजी और कॉमन हाइड्रोलॉजी को अडॉप्ट कर लिया, तो हमारे झगड़े जो हैं वो दोस्ती में बदल जाएंगे। इसी तरह से अफगानिस्तान के साथ, इसी तरह से सूबों के दरमियान। अभी तो आपका सिस्टम यह है कि फार्मर फार्मर से लड़ रहा है, सूबा सूबे से लड़ रहा है, मुल्क मुल्क से लड़ रहा है, क्योंकि हम हर जगह पे पानी को डिवाइड कर रहे हैं। हमने पानी को डिवाइड नहीं करना। पानी को जिस तरह नेचर ने एज एन इंटीग्रेटेड इकोलॉजिकल सिस्टम में एज ए होल बनाया है, हमने पानी को उसी तरह से होल रखना है और अपना लाइफस्टाइल उसके गिर्द जो है वो अडाप्ट करना है। हमने पानी को डिवाइड कर दिया अपने लाइफस्टाइल के हिसाब से, जबकि हमें उल्टा हिसाब करना चाहिए। तो जिस दिन हमें ये अकल आ गई, उस दिन मसाइल खत्म हो जाएंगे। और मैं राफे से बहुत 200% एग्री करता हूं कि ना तो वाटर शॉर्टेज है ना वाटर क्राइसिस है। दिस इज ऑल मैन मेड। ये हमारी मेंटेलिटी है जो प्रॉब्लम क्रिएट कर रही है। पानी मेंटेलिटी पानी प्रॉब्लम नहीं क्रिएट कर जी।
मैं इसमें सर एक इजाफी बात बड़ी
अच्छा,
मुश्किल से कर सकता हूँ,
डॉक्टर
बिकॉज
साहब,
आपने वो सैयद नकवी की किताब चेंज, तो उसके हवाले से मैं एक चीज कहना चाहता था कि जब ये मधुपुर और अपर बारी दोआब कनाल कॉलोनीज बनी थी, तो जब जमीन लोगों में बांटी गई थी, और आप बिल्कुल दुरुस्त कह रहे हैं, सिख खलसे में लोगों को बांटी गई थी और लोगों को बांटी गई थी, तो चले, आई एम बैक. If I can just finish that, the land grants that were given were not equal. लोगों को क्या कहते हैं, एक किस्म के प्लॉट नहीं मिले. अंग्रेजों ने जब given extra land was given to people because the British felt that they needed to inject capitalism into the system to make what they called lazy Indians work. तो ये जो feudals हैं, ये जो जमींदार हैं, ये अंग्रेजों के बनाए गए थे जब इन्होंने कनाल कॉलोनीज बनाई थी. اگر آپ اوکاڑا جائیں وہاں جب آپ یہ the canal colonies over there وہاں ایکول زمین دی گئی تھی بیکاز وہاں جو زمین تھی وہ گھوڑوں کے کھانے کے لیے کیا کہتے ہیں جو فصل وغیرہ گھاس وغیرہ تھی اس کے لیے تھی and people got equal land. There was division, there was difference sown by the British in the canal colonies that we are suffering from today.
Okay, if there are no questions, I think I have a couple of things to.
I have a question.
You have a question, Ahmed Osama. Okay, please go ahead.
Ma'am, Dr. Hassan has explained the different aspects of IWT. So my questions are, what are the present challenges around the compliance of IWT? And the second one is there any provision about the sharing mechanism of water in dry years in IWT?
I'm sure ڈاکٹر صاحب آپ اس کا جواب دے سکتے ہیں. جی
ڈاکٹر صاحب آپ انمیوٹ کر لیں اپنے آپ کو, پلیز انمیوٹ یور سیلف. جی
Okay, am I audible now?
جی
Okay, great. Okay, جہاں تک انڈس واٹر ٹریٹی کا تعلق ہے نا, تو اگر آپ میرا پرسنل اوپینین لیتے ہیں تو آئی ڈو ناٹ ایکچولی کنسیڈر اٹ اے ٹریٹی, کیونکہ دیکھیں ٹریٹی جو ہے نا وہ دو پارٹیز کا ڈفرینس ہوتا ہے ٹو بگین ود, اور اس کے بعد میں دونوں پارٹیز تھوڑا تھوڑا گیو کرتی ہیں, تھوڑا تھوڑا ٹیک کرتی ہیں, اینڈ دے میٹ سم ویئر ان دا مڈل, تو وہ ٹریٹی بن جاتی ہے. لیکن اگر انڈس واٹر ٹریٹی کی آپ ہسٹری میں جائیں تو انڈیا نے 1948 میں جب پاکستان کا پانی بند کیا تو انڈیا نے کہا کہ میں نے یہ سارے دریا بند کرنے ہیں اور میں نے کوئی پانی پاکستان کے بیچ میں فلو نہیں کرنے دینا, اور یہ میرا رائٹ ہے, اور پاکستان ہیز ٹو ایگری ٹو دس رائٹ. ادروائز اگر پاکستان اس رائٹ کو ایگری نہیں کرتا تو میں پانی نہیں چھوڑوں گا. اور اس وقت ایک ڈومینین اکارڈ سائن ہوئی تھی پاکستان اور انڈیا کے درمیان میں, جس میں پاکستان کو بہت ڈیسپریٹ ضرورت تھی اریگیٹڈ واٹر کی اپنے کسانوں کے لیے, اور وہ 6 مہینے کا ایک ایگریمنٹ سائن ہوا تھا, اور انہوں نے اسی ایگریمنٹ کو لے کے وہ آگے چلے انڈس واٹر ٹریٹی کے ٹائم کے اوپر, اور انہوں نے ڈیمانڈ رکھی کہ ہم نے 100% پانی لینا ہے. اور ایٹ دی اینڈ آف دا ڈے تقریباً 12 سال کی نیگوسیشنز 1948 سے لے کے 1960 تک چلتی رہیں, جس میں 1951 آنورڈ ورلڈ بینک بھی شامل ہو گیا. سارا کچھ ہونے کے باوجود جو فارمولاز ٹیبل کے اوپر رکھے گئے, جو انیشیل پوزیشن رکھی گئی, اس میں انڈیا نے کہا کہ جی میں نے 100% پانی لینا ہے اور میں نے پاکستان کو ان دریاؤں کا پانی نہیں دینا, اور اس نے یہ بھی کہا کہ میں نے 5 to 7% پانی جو ہے ویسٹرن ریورس کا لینا ہے. پاکستان کا موقف یہ تھا کہ ہم نے اپ ٹو 30% پانی ہم ایسٹرن ریورس کا انڈیا کو دے سکتے ہیں, اور ویسٹرن ریورس کا ہم 100% پانی استعمال کریں گے. لیکن جب ٹریٹی سائن ہوتی ہے تو وہ 100% چیزیں جو انڈیا ڈے 1 سے کہہ رہا تھا وہ ساری انڈیا کو مل جاتی ہیں. تو ٹریٹی کہاں پہ ہوئی؟ یہ تو ٹریٹی ہے ہی نہیں ہے. اس میں تو صرف انڈیا نے جو انٹرنیشنل لاز کی وائلیشنز کی, جس کے بارے میں لیلیانتھر خود لکھتا ہے کہ پاکستان کا کیس بہت سٹرونگ تھا اور پاکستان انٹرنیشنل کورٹ میں جا کے مقدمہ جیت سکتا تھا. پاکستان کو وہ مقدمہ نہیں لڑنے دیا گیا. پاکستان کی حکومت کو کنونس کیا گیا کہ آپ مت جائیں مقدمہ لڑنے کے لیے, ہم آپ کو قرضہ دے کے تو آپ کے 2 ڈیم بنوا دیں گے. اور ان 2 ڈیموں کے چکر میں آپ نے کشمیر کی کاز پہ بھی کمپرومائز کیا, کیونکہ یہی لیلینتھل صاحب تھے, انہوں نے کشمیر کی کاز کے بارے میں لکھا تھا. پلیبیسائٹ کے بارے میں انہوں نے پلیبیسائٹ کو ان الفاظ کے ساتھ ریڈیکیول کیا تھا کہ کاؤنٹنگ نوزز ان کشمیر, کشمیر میں ناک گننے سے اس نے تشبیہ دی تھی پلیبیسائٹ کو, اور اس نے کہا تھا کہ نہیں ہونی چاہیے. لیلینتھل نے لکھا تھا کہ کشمیر ایک گیٹ وے ہے ریڈ تبت, ریڈ چائنا اور سوویت رشیا کے لیے, ٹو انٹر انٹو دی فرٹائل اینڈ productive lands of Pakistan and India and go all the way to Indian Ocean. تو اس لیے کشمیر میں پلیبیسائٹ نہیں ہونی چاہیے, کشمیر کا جھگڑا چلتے رہنا چاہیے تاکہ یہ گیٹ وے مت کھلے. یہ کولڈ وار کی اسٹریٹجی تھی, کولڈ وار کی پالیسی تھی. یہ تو ٹریٹی ہے ہی نہیں ہے, یہ تو کولڈ وار کا ایک ٹول تھا انڈیا اور پاکستان کو قابو کرنے کے لیے، جس میں آپ نے کشمیر کو کمپرومائز کیا، آپ نے اپنے دریاؤں کا بیڑا غرق کیا، آپ نے انسسٹینیبل سولوشنز اڈاپٹ کیے، آپ نے اپنے دریاؤں کے بیچ میں ضرورت سے زیادہ کانکریٹ ڈال دیا، اور آپ کہتے ہیں کہ یہ ٹریٹی ہے، اور یہ ٹریٹی ٹوٹی نہیں ہے، اس پہ جنگیں ہو گئی ہیں. بھائی اس میں ٹوٹنے والا ہے کیا؟ جو کوئی آپ کا اپر رائپیرین کر سکتا تھا، آپ نے 100% اس کے کیے دھرے کو لیگلائز کر دیا، اور آپ اس کو کہتے ہیں کہ یہ ٹریٹی ہے. دس از ناٹ اے ٹریٹی. اور میں یہ بات اس وقت کر رہا ہوں، اور آئی ایم شیور کہ پولیٹیکل سچویشن تھوڑی سی اور چینج ہو جائے گی 150 سال کے بعد، تو پوری دنیا یہی بات کرے گی کہ دس از ناٹ اے ٹریٹی. 50 سال پہلے جب یہ ٹریٹی ہوئی تھی تو اس وقت جو بات میں آج کر رہا ہوں یہ کرنا ناممکن تھا، اور جنہوں نے کی یہ بات، فاطمہ جناح واز ون آف دیم، ان پہ غداری کا الزام لگا. مسعود کھدر پوش واز ون آف دی بیوروکریٹس جس نے اس ٹریٹی کو اپوز کیا تھا، اور اس کو ایوب خان نے کہا تھا کہ میں تمہیں دیوار کے ساتھ کھڑا کر کے گولی مار دوں گا اگر تم اپنا منہ بند نہیں رکھو گے. تو ایسی بات نہیں ہے کہ اس کو اپوز کرنے والے نہیں تھے. لوگوں نے ایوب خان کو سمجھانے کی کوشش کی کہ بھائی اگر انڈیا نے آپ کا پانی سارا روک بھی لیا ہے تو ہمیں یہ ٹریٹی سائن نہیں کرنی چاہیے گی، ایٹ لیسٹ وی ول ہیو اے ہائر مورل گراؤنڈ. لیکن اگر آپ ٹریٹی سائن کر دیتے ہیں تو انڈیا نے جتنی انٹرنیشنل لاز کی خلاف ورزیاں کی ہیں وہ سب لیگلائز اور کور ہو جاتی ہیں، اور آپ اس کے ساتھ پارٹی بن جاتے ہیں. تو یہ تو ٹریٹی ہے ہی نہیں. اس میں تو آپ نے ایک انٹرنیشنل کنونشنز، انٹرنیشنل لاز، انوائرمنٹل ڈیگریڈیشن، ہر چیز پہ آپ پارٹی بن گئے. دنیا میں کہیں پہ 3 دریاؤں کو اس طریقے سے بند نہیں کیا گیا جس طرح سے انڈس واٹر ٹریٹی نے بند کیا. میرے حساب سے تو انڈیا کی گورنمنٹ، ورلڈ بینک اور پاکستان کی اس وقت کی گورنمنٹ، یہ 3 انوائرمنٹل ٹیررسٹ تھے جنہوں نے اپنے پولیٹیکل فائدے کے لیے اور فائنینشیل فائدے کے لیے ایک پورے ریور سسٹم کا بیڑا غرق کیا، انوائرمنٹ کو تباہ کیا. اور آج وہ کہتے ہیں کہ جناب یہ ٹریٹی ہے، اور یہ ٹریٹی جو ہے نا یہ بڑی اچھی ٹریٹی ہے، اور اس میں جنگیں ہوئی ہیں اور یہ ٹریٹی نہیں ٹوٹی. نو سر، دس از ناٹ اے ٹریٹی. تھینک یو.
Dr. Sir, yeah, question, treaty, of course, it is not a treaty. But given the historical context of India and Pakistan, and the way India started off by stopping the waters of Pakistan in 1948, do you think we could have sustained at that time, going back in history, we could have sustained that stoppage of water? And what were the options available not to stop the flow of the river and not to kill the river? I use the word kill the river. We have killed the rivers, in fact, by putting these dams and stopping the water, because when you stop the water of the river, you are killing life, because there is so much of life in the water which gets killed if the water is stopped. So what was the option, given that Pakistan was I recall from what I have read is that it was such a difficult situation that they had even Firozpur ka jo tha, unhone bijli bhi band kar di, unhone pani bhi band kar diya, and it was really a bad situation. In other words, was Pakistan pushed against the wall? I do understand that there were interests of the powerful people, which still are there. So what could have Pakistan done at that time by not agreeing to this kind of a situation that we are in? I know in Europe you have not stopped the flow of rivers. The river Danube flows in 7 or 8 countries, and nobody stops the flow of the river. So are there other rivers which are there? No dams are being built on those rivers. So what was the option at that time? Why? How could we not be in this situation that we are in now?
اوکے پہلی بات تو یہ ہے کہ جب انڈیا نے ہمارا پانی بند کیا ہے 1948 میں، تو اس پہ ہم کتنا امپیکٹ ہوئے تھے. ہمارا جو ٹوٹل ایریا اریگیٹڈ امپیکٹ ہوا تھا دیٹ واز اباؤٹ 5%. 5% وہ ایریا تھا جس کے اوپر سوئنگ ہوئی تھی، اور جو آپ کا ٹوٹل اریگیٹڈ ایریا تھا اس کا 8% امپیکٹ ہوا تھا. تو آپ نے اس 5% کو بچانے کے لیے آپ نے اپنے 3 دریا چھوڑ دیے، آپ نے کشمیر کی کاز چھوڑ دی، اور آپ نے اپنے دریاؤں کے بیچ میں 2 انسسٹینیبل کانکریٹ کے بلاکس رکھ دیے جس کی وجہ سے آپ کا انڈس کا ڈیلٹا بالکل تباہ ہو گیا. تو یہ آپ نے کاسٹ پے کی ہے اس 5% کو مینج کرنے کی, جو اگر آپ 5% مینج نہ بھی کرتے تو آپ سروائیو کر سکتے تھے. میں کہتا ہوں 1 منٹ کے لیے آپ ایزیوم کر لیں کہ آپ نے وہ 5% ایریا ابینڈن کر دیتے. آپ کہتے ٹھیک ہے, جدھر آپ اتنے زیادہ ملینز آف ریفیوجیز کو ایبزارب کر رہے تھے اپنے ملک میں, اور ایک بڑی ہائی اسپرٹ تھی اس وقت پاکستان کی قوم میں, آپ اسی اسپرٹ کو آپ کی لیڈرشپ جو ہے وہ چینلائز اس طرح سے کرتی کہ ٹھیک ہے جی, یہ وہ لوگ ہیں جو انڈیا کی اگریشن کی وجہ سے متاثر ہوئے ہیں, ہم ان کو یہاں سے نکالیں گے اور ہم ان کو کہیں اور زمین دیں گے. جس طرح آپ باقی ریفیوجیز کو دے رہے تھے, آپ ان لوگوں کے ساتھ بھی اس اسپرٹ کے ساتھ چل سکتے تھے. یہ کوئی اتنی ناممکن بات نہیں ہے. دنیا آپ کے ساتھ آتی, دنیا آپ کے ساتھ آتی, دنیا آپ کے ساتھ کھڑی ہوتی. آپ دیکھیں پولیٹیکلی پاکستان کی وہ آئسولیشن نہیں تھی جو بعد میں آپ کی غلط پالیسیوں کی وجہ سے ہو گئی کمپیئر ٹو انڈیا. آپ دیکھیں کہ ڈیلیگیشن جو ہے 1948 میں وار شروع ہوئی تو ڈیلیگیشن جو ہے انٹرنیشنل وہ کہاں پہ آیا؟ وہ دہلی میں نہیں آیا, وہ کراچی میں آیا, وچ واز یور فرسٹ ڈپلومیٹک سکسیس. اسی طرح سے جو آپ کا انڈس واٹر کی جس وقت بات چیت شروع ہوئی تو باتیں کراچی سے شروع ہوئی. تو آپ پولیٹیکلی آلریڈی ایک ہائر مورل گراؤنڈ کے اوپر اور ایک ہائر پوزیشن کے اوپر تھے. آپ کا کام تھا آپ انٹرنیشنل لابی, انٹرنیشنل کمیونٹی کو اپنے ساتھ ملا کے چلتے. انڈیا نے ایک نیکڈ اگریشن کی تھی آپ کے خلاف, آپ کا کام تھا کہ آپ اس نیکڈ اگریشن کو دنیا میں پروجیکٹ کرتے, ہائی لائٹ کرتے اور دنیا کو اپنے ساتھ لے کے چلتے. آپ کو صرف وہ جو ایک $4 کا لالچ آ گیا نا, انہوں نے آپ کو فلیش آف کیش کیا کہ جی دیکھو دیکھو تم ان کی بات مان لو تو ہم تمہیں جو ہے نا وہ اتنے ڈالر دیں گے. آپ نے زندگی میں کبھی اتنے ڈالر کی شکل نہ دیکھی ہو تو آپ کو پھر بڑا اچھا لگتا ہے. پھر آپ اپنے لوگوں کو ڈرانا دھمکانا شروع کر دیتے ہیں کہ بھئی چپ کر جاؤ, ڈالر آنے لگے ہیں. تو یہ جو ایک ڈالر والی مینٹیلٹی تھی نا ہماری, قرضے لے کے آگے چلنا, وہ مینٹیلٹی 1952 میں کوٹری بیراج کا پہلا قرضہ ہم نے لیا تھا, اور اس دن سے لے کے آج تک وہ قرضے بڑے ہیں, کم نہیں ہوئے, اور اکانومی کا اور دریاؤں کا اور پولوشن کا بیڑا غرق ہوا ہے اور بہتری نہیں آئی. تو اس لیے ایسی کوئی بات نہیں ہے کہ آپ کے پاس آپشنز کوئی نہیں تھی, آپشنز آپ کے پاس بہت تھیں. انٹرنیشنل کمیونٹی آپ کے ساتھ کھڑی تھی اور آپ یو آر آن دا رائٹ سائڈ. یعنی سب سے بڑی تو بات یہ کہ آپ ایگریسر نہیں تھے, آپ سپریس تھے. تو آپ کو تو اس چیز کا ایڈوانٹیج لینا چاہیے تھا, آپ نے نہیں لیا. تو اور وہی میں بات کر رہا ہوں کہ صرف 5% ایریا تھا جس کے لیے آپ نے 3 دریا اور کشمیر کاز اور سب کچھ دے دیا. آپ نے قرضوں میں اپنے آپ کو ڈبو لیا, ابھی تک نہیں نکلے.
So do you think there is ji
could you allow me to share my screen? I'd like to
Ji.
illustrate the point that Dr. Saab is making here.
Let me see how can I do that.
Because the response of the treaty to the Indian aggression also has to be seen in context. Dr. Saab bilkul baat sahi kar rahe hain کہ جب ہندوستان نے کنال بند کیے تھے, دریا نہیں بند کیے.
Now you
یہ
can share
دیکھیے گا
this.
جی,
Yeah.
اوکے یہ دیکھیے گا جی, this is a map of the canals that were built by the British from the mid 1800s till partition. ٹھیک ہے جی, they're all numbered up and chronologically listed here as well. So if you can see my cursor, the partition line is somewhere here. ٹھیک ہے جی, جس میں majorly upper باری دواب is affected. مگر یہ جو سرہند کنال ہے, this is mostly an Indian territory to begin with. آپ کا جو رقبہ افیکٹ ہو رہا تھا وہ یہ اپر باری دواب کا لارجلی ہو رہا تھا. اینڈ یہاں یاد رکھیے they were disproportionately powerful landed یہ زمیندار جو کہ اس وقت کے یونینسٹ پارٹی کے لوگ تھے. You see, the response was disproportionate. If you look at the overall canal and water resource, if you look at the fact that within 10-15 years of partition, electricity was widely available enough for tube wells to be used as they are now the major form of water. You see, maybe we didn't need to have an Indus Treaty as a result of the aggression, because this was not that much of the resource that was being affected. And when you consider the groundwater resources that we had, Dr. Sabir, that's 10 times the surface volume. Ye itna bada masla nahi tha that we leverage our future out to these development funds. और you know, it's coincidental, हम 60s की दहाई को समझते हैं कि ये decade of development था, मगर वो पैसे कहीं से आ रहे थे. Just like, you know, the early 2000s were a decade of development in Pakistan, but remember there was a lot of money coming in because of the war on terror. You have to look at the backdrop of these things as well, for which we sacrificed tens of thousands of people in the case of the war on terror, and for which we sacrificed our water resources in the case of the Indus Water Treaty.
So do you think that there can be reversal to this policy, and in the subcontinent we start sharing the rivers? Looking at the upper riparians always have the upper hand, and they can since we cannot assume that all human beings are good natured and they will always be nice to other people. People always try to take advantage and benefits, and they will have their interest, and there is going to be some clash of interest. And how do we try to put in our law that people, there is equity, there is fairness? Because if these kind of relationships among human beings and within the countries and within the country and between the countries, there has to be some law which would kind of give some fair decisions. And if we find that, because India, I think, is going to be upper riparian always, because all the rivers, they start from Kashmir, and it's going to be like this. So will there be any fair distribution of water until unless everybody starts thinking in the same way, that we have to take care of the ecology and environment and life? And life means life not only of human beings, of all kind of lives. So only when we have a law, and when people, and the law is adjudicated, and there is a fair trial and a fair decision taken, those who are violators, they are punished, only then that kind of an equity will prevail, and that sense of justice and fairness is going to be there. Do we see in this kind of an environment of mistrust, first within the two countries and then within the country? So how do
The
we
short
deal
answer
this?
is no. Because the water dispute between India and Pakistan is handled by Delhi and by Islamabad, and there are too many other issues between these two capitals for water to be sensibly negotiated, unfortunately.
May I add a little bit to this one?
Please.
Yeah, may I add my bit onto this one? You see, despite all the negativities that I've been discussing so far, all the mistakes that we have done in the past, you know, past is past, and let bygone be bygone. We still have future, and there are so many opportunities which are there for the future. One of the best opportunity that we have is the emerging global mind. The way the whole world is now thinking. There are things like sustainability development goals. There had been Millennium Development Goals before that. Everyone is now talking about environmental restoration, harmony with nature. You know, there were things which were like in the past, people could say with straight face, but they were downright wrong. For example, slavery. Slavery was wrong to begin with. But then there were people like leaders like Thomas Jefferson, who could say with a straight face that slavery is good. Slavery is good for America. Slavery is good for the American economy. Today, you can't do that because the global mind has changed. You cannot say such things with a straight face. The same thing is coming in terms of environmental degradation, environmental protection, environmental awareness. And that is our opportunity for the future. And we don't have to worry too much about what our neighbors are doing right now or would do right now. If we just start fixing ourselves, if we just start taking care of the environment within our own land, it will start building a moral pressure on our upstream neighbors to actually conform to the international practices and care, and start following the global mind on sustainability and green economy. You know, as I mentioned earlier, you uh, are only divided by water when you divide water. And all the economic engines that we have thought so far in the Indus Basin are the ones which are based on division of water. There are other economic engines which are based on using the water undivided. For example, ecological tourism is one in which you do not divide water, taking advantage of the intrinsic value of water, taking advantage of the ecological services that your rivers provide you, like fish, wildlife, clean drinking water, aquifer recharge. If you start invoking those economic engines within your water management, then whether they like it or not, our upstream neighbors will have to adopt the same type of economic engines which are green in nature. And when on the international forum, you go to these UN conventions and COP and all those conferences and events which are related to protecting the planet and protecting the environment, you know, that thing is now gaining pace. It's not going to get any weaker. It's going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. And then there will be more people talking about the unsustainable projects and unsustainable economic engines that we had adopted in the previous centuries. So we have an opportunity to start following the global mind, start following sustainability, and the things will not turn right overnight, but then we will actually have a direction which would lead to sustainability in future. And that's where we can start, and our neighbors will have no other choice but to follow us and join hands with us. And I can see a very peaceful future of the Indus River system with the current emerging global mind. Yeah.
Right. I have, I think, one more question, but I think we are running out of time. And I would say Dr. Fatiha is here. That should be the last question. Dr. Fatiha, if you can please be, because we are overshooting the time. Let this be the last question.
I wanted to ask, how can a member of the community contribute to the future sustainability measures? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Rafi, would you like to respond? How?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to advocate large-scale irrigation change or moving from surface storages to groundwater storages. Those are high-level technical and require politics and money. I'm going to speak about one or two things you can perhaps do individually. Do you know it takes about 10,000 liters of water to grow an animal, a cow, big enough to produce a kilogram of beef? 4 लोगों की कढ़ाई में 15,000 लीटर पानी लगता है. ये मैंने जो कॉटन की कमीज पहनी हुई है, इसमें कोई 6 से 7,000 लीटर पानी लगता है to be able to grow the cotton and in the process itself. One should be aware of the water footprint of their consumerism. You want to make a difference on water? Stop eating meat. You want to make a difference in water? Okay, well, let's look at what we wear. Let's look at how we behave. Because turning the tap off when you brush your teeth will save maybe a liter or liter and a half. Not eating meat every day will save tens of thousands of liters of water. As simple as that.
Yes, less consumerism is one way of reducing the water footprints, and that we should know. Less consumerism. Again, that's again a new liberal kind of a approach when people say consume more, and it's going to be more. If you're going to consume more, you will have more growth. So these are quite cross-cutting things, and we have to, as a consumer, as an individual, I think this is the lesson that we should, what we say, reduce, reuse, recycle. And if we can recycle water as well, and there are technologies which are available, the water that we use, it can be recycled. There are countries which are using this technology, and the governments are encouraging. There are laws where they say that you should recycle your domestic water instead of using fresh water to garden, to water your garden or to wash your vehicle. Reuse the recycled water, and you can do many things with the recycled water. So I think there are many ways of reducing that consumption of water. But I must say, I'm really grateful. This discussion is very interesting, and we can go on for another hour, but I do not want to keep you here for such a long time. I'm really grateful to Dr. Hassan and Ahmed Rafi Alam Saab for joining us on this very interesting debate, and for all the participants who are here. Thank you very much from on behalf of the university and the School of Governance and Society. I'm grateful to both of you and to our participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया.
Khudafis. Shukriya ji.